Using the quadratic formula, let's solve x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. And now there are two steps that go into solving an equation using the quadratic formula. The first step is to identify the values a, b, and c from the quadratic expression that you're going to use to substitute into the formula. And then step 2 is simply substituting those values into the formula and simplifying it as much as you can to solve for your values of x. So let's talk about step 1. Every time you see a quadratic equation or a quadratic expression, it will always have the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is the coefficient of the x squared, b is the coefficient of the x by itself, and c is the constant term on the end. So for this example, let's identify our values of a, b, and c. X squared by itself means the coefficient is 1, and so corresponding to a, our a value is 1. The coefficient of our single term of x is 3, and so corresponding to b, we can say that b equals 3. And then the constant term on the end is minus 5. And so our value for c is minus 5. So now that we've found our values for a, b, and c, we can solve this equation using the quadratic formula. And now, using the equation that we have here in the top right, x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided on 2a, we can solve this formula. So using our values that we have in blue, we can write the first line of the equation. So minus b, our value for b is 3, so minus b will be minus 3, plus or minus, and that represents the two possible values you can get, because as you can recall, whenever you have a quadratic expression or quadratic equation, you can get two values of x. So plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's 3 squared, minus 4 times our value for a, which is 1, times our value for c, which is minus 5. And that's all divided by 2 times a, which is 1. Now we can simplify that into minus 3 plus or minus, and then we can work out what this square root becomes. So 3 squared is 9, and then minus 4 times minus 5 is positive 20, times 1 is 20. So that becomes 9 plus 20, which we can see straight away is 29, all divided by 2 times 1, which is just 2. And so from here, can we actually simplify it any further? Minus 3 is not divisible by 2, and the square root of 29 is the most simplified form. And so from that, we can now write our two solutions for x. So our first solution, x equals minus 3, and then choose either the plus or the minus variant. So let's say plus square root 29 divided by 2, or x equals minus 3 minus the square root of 29 divided by 2. And these are our two solutions for x, and we've solved the equation using the quadratic formula. You just need to be careful when writing your two solutions. Notice that one has a plus and one has a minus, and that corresponds to the plus and minus in the formula. For our next example, let's solve 2x squared plus 5x plus 3 equals 0. And so the way we do this, our first step is identifying our values of a, b, and c. A is the coefficient next to the x squared. And we can see just by reading that that is 2. B is the coefficient of the x to the power of 1 in the middle. And we can see here that it's positive 5. And c is our constant term on the end. And we can see that that there is positive 3. And so now we have our values for a, b, and c. We can substitute them into the quadratic formula to help us solve for x. So let's write the first line. X equals minus b, so minus 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 25 squared, no, 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 3. And all of that divided by 2a. And 2a is 2 times 2, which is just 4. And next, let's continue simplifying. So x equals minus 5 plus or minus the square root. And now we can simplify inside the square root. So 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 2 times 3. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. So 25 minus 24 over 4. That equals minus 5 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 4. And we know that the square root of 1 is just simply 1. So we can leave this as minus 5 plus or minus 1 on 4. And so from here, can we simplify this any further? Is there any number that we can divide minus 5, 1, and 4 by? And there isn't. So that means now that we've simplified it as much as we can write our two solutions for x. So the first solution, x equals minus 5 plus 1 on 4, or x equals minus 5 minus 1 on 4. And in the last question, we couldn't simplify our final answer further. But in this case here, because these are whole integers, we can actually simplify our answers one step further. So if we just collect the terms as we would usually, on the left-hand side, minus 5 plus 1 is minus 4. And that leaves us with minus 4 divided by 4, which is just minus 1. And on the right-hand side, minus 5 minus 1 is minus 6. So then we'd have minus 6 on 4, which we can simplify to minus 3 on 2. And so our final answers and values for x equals minus 1 or minus 3 on 2. And those are the solutions and how you would solve this question using the quadratic formula. For our next example, let's solve x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 0, and we'll do that using the quadratic formula. Our first step is identifying the values a, b, and c. A is the coefficient of x squared, and that is just 1. B is the coefficient of x by itself, which is minus 4. And c is the constant term on the end, and that there is just 1. And so now using these values, we can substitute them into the quadratic formula and then simplify to find our values of x. So x equals minus b. So minus 4 is just positive 4. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so minus 4 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is also 1. And all that divided by 2a, 2 times 1, which is just 2. And so now let's simplify this. X equals 4 plus or minus. Now the square root, minus 4 squared is minus 4 times minus 4. So two negative numbers multiplied together results in a positive number, which is the same as 4 times 4, and that's 16. Minus 4 times 1 is just 4. So that's what our square root now looks like. All that divided by 2. Then our next line, x equals 4 plus or minus square root 16 minus 4 is 12 divided by 2. And we can simplify this square root by taking out a square number. So our next line, 4 plus or minus 12 is the same thing as 4 times 3. And we know that the square root of 4 is 2. So we can simplify that further. So our next line, x equals 4 plus or minus, if we take out the square root of 4, that's a 2 times, and we still have the 3 inside the square root. And all of that divided by 2. Now, can we simplify this any further? Well, 4 and 2 can both be divided by 2. So we can get rid of the denominator in this expression. If we divide all the numbers by 2, we're left with 4 divided by 2 is just 2, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we're left with just the root 3. And in the denominator, 2 divided by 2 is also 1, so we don't need a denominator anymore. And now we can read our two solutions from here. Our first solution, 2 plus root 3. And then our second solution will be x equals 2 minus root 3. And that is how you'd use the quadratic formula to solve this question. For our final example, let's solve 2x squared plus 3x plus 5 equals 0. So our first step, once again, is identify the values of a, b, and c. So the coefficient of x squared is 2, which means a equals 2. The coefficient of our x in the middle is positive 3, so b equals 3. And our constant term on the end is positive 5, which means c equals 5. And now we substitute those values into the quadratic formula. So x equals minus b, so minus 3, plus or minus square root of b squared, so 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 5, on 2a, which is 2 times 2, and that's 4. And so then the next line is minus 3 plus or minus square root. 3 squared is 9, minus 4 times 2 is 8, and then 8 times 5 is 40, all divided by 4. And now when we simplify this square root, there's something that we need to take note of. So 9 minus 40 is negative 31. And that actually means that there are no solutions for x in this question, because you cannot square root a negative number. And so this looks at the concept of the discriminant. And we'll go over that in another video, but that looks at b squared minus 4ac. And that can help you predict how many solutions you'll have whenever you have a question. But for the sake of this example, what you need to know is because we have a negative number in our square root when using the quadratic formula, it means there are no solutions for x. And so then you could just say x has no solutions. And so this video covers the quadratic formula and how to use it. You just need to remember the first step is always identifying the values of a, b, and c, and that the standard form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c. And then once you've identified those three values, you substitute them into the quadratic formula and then simplify and find your solutions for x.